Hello, welcome back to ACTV. I am Alec Cizak, of course, and I'm joined today by poet and crime fiction writer Robert Ragan. Robert, why don't you start by telling my audience who you are and what it is you do?
I'm Robert Ragan from Lewington, North Carolina. I've been writing for over 20 years. I started out writing at the age of 19 every day. I wrote poetry for 10 years. And then whenever I was 29, I started experimenting with writing fiction. And I wrote fiction for years. I completed novel first drafts that were horrible, like tons of short stories. But now in the last, I want to say 2 or 3 years, I kind of went back to my roots with poetry, and I'm kind of balancing back and forth with fiction and poetry. And poetry made me lazy, by the way.
How so? How did poetry make you lazy?
With fiction, I feel like it's kind of a struggle, like keeping up with plots and logic and everything, and it's kind of a headache at times. But with poetry, it was just free flowing, just easy for me to just crank out these poems.
Well, that's interesting because some people say that the hierarchy of writers is that the novelist is on the lowest end because the novelist uses the most words to express himself, and the short story writer is next up because he uses fewer words. But the poet is at the top of the pyramid because the poet uses the fewest words possible to say the most. What do you think of that?
I mean, in my opinion, I think it's way more difficult to write fiction and tell a good story with me. But at the same time, I think a lot of my poetry also tells stories too, but just in a shorter narrative form. But I still think it's way more difficult to write fiction.
Do
To
you
me,
think that you're, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
like now poetry is like more of a side project. Like it's just I can sit there. A lot of these poems were probably written in 20 minutes tops.
Robert, how do you think your poetry and your fiction writing, or do you think that they feed off each other or they inspire one another? Do you see any interaction there between the two formats?
Yeah, I definitely do at times. I mean, for the most part, I kind of try to keep it separate, but when it comes to like my crime and poverty type poetry, I think a lot of those blend into like storytelling.
Okay, well, you are about to release a book of poetry called Nothing is Sacred. And if you'd like, can you tell us? I guess my first question about it is how did you go about organizing? I mean, this is a huge collection of poetry. How did you organize all those poems? What was your thinking going into that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I need to thank you for this process because, like I said before, if you hadn't put me on that deadline, we might still be waiting around to this day. But in the first place, which I mean, this is probably odd, but I do most of my writing on Facebook. Like it's not on, I don't post it, but it's there, for me to see. And I had tons of poems that I had written on Facebook, and I just went back and copy pasted it. I think it was well over 100, like 118 or something like that. And submitted them to you. And I mean, like I said, I've been when it comes to the process of actually doing it, I'm all for it. But when it comes to the editing and all the other work behind it, I'm really bad about procrastinating. And so you giving me that deadline, it kind of kicked me in gear to actually, well, I'm like, Alex, serious about this. So I need to go ahead because, this is what I want. So I need to go ahead and make sure I take care of this and not slack off.
Let me ask you this. What are you hoping to accomplish with this huge collection of poetry?
I mean, I just hope readers enjoy it. I hope I hope it sells and I hope people enjoy it.
For my audience, could you maybe tell us a little bit about your poetry? What separates it from other poetry out there? What are some of the thoughts that go through your head when you get ready to write a poem?
I mean, it'll pop in my head sometimes. There's different things that come to inspire them. And anyway, I think what sets me apart from a lot of other poets is like I'm real brutally honest about myself. I say a lot of things about myself that are true that I think most people would be ashamed of putting out there in the public.
Can you give us any examples? You comfortable giving us some examples of that?
Oh yeah, definitely like poems about my kids, which I realized reading back through the collection that there's a lot of poems about my kids, like one on one about my daughter, one on one about my son, or poems that's about them both. And I realized that I had talked a lot about that, talked a lot about my parents and my relationship with them. Something I've been struggling with lately is about animal abuse and abandoning animals and stuff. And I realized that I had talked about that in the book too. You know, talked about my struggles of dealing with having a ton of cats, and like the whole book was just therapeutic, basically. Like
Well, what would you, so somebody, let's say somebody coming from, say, a country club background, what would you say to them to prepare them for reading your poetry?
hmm, I mean, a lot of them could probably relate to certain aspects of this book. I think so. I mean, I talk about drugs, poverty, um, romance, all types of different things in this book.
Well, speaking of poverty, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say like family dynamics. You know what I'm saying? Just with fiction or poetry, whatever it is, I try to be diverse and talk about a lot of different things.
So you mentioned poverty a couple of times now. Do you think that in literature in general, especially today, do you think the subject of poverty is approached um, regularly enough and honestly enough?
I mean, not really. I don't think so. I mean, there's a few poets doing it, and there's a few writers in crime fiction that capture it pretty well, but for the most part, I don't. And I mean,
Right.
I might be wrong for saying this, but I mean, I think a lot of writers they might live a cozy life, you know what I'm saying? But me, I definitely don't live a cozy life at all. You know what I'm saying? I'm living in a broke down trailer, just like I talk about in the collection, living in a broke down trailer, like fucking ragged. And I mean, I'm living week to week on checks, barely getting by. And I mean, this shit is like true to me. And so I feel like I'm talking about it like I'm talking about it realistically. I'm sorry, I'm kind of distracted.
No. Why are you distracted?
Oh, cars going by and then like some people out in the yard.
Oh, yeah. Are there any writers, either writers that we all know about or contemporary writers? Are there any you could name that you think do a relatively good job depicting life on the in poverty?
I think my friend Mike Zone, I think well, he captures poverty, but at the same time he captures this working class America vibe that like I don't see a lot of other people doing.
Can you tell my audience why is it? Some people in the audience might say, "Well, why is it so important that we get an accurate depiction of poverty in literature?" Do you have an answer for that?
I mean, to me it's like most of what our audience, I mean, I don't know about your audience. Well, yeah, your audience definitely too, but my audience is like a lot of times they like dark, real things, you know what I'm saying? And so if that's what you like, then you should be well aware of like real poverty, like what people are going through.
Mhm. And you said that you also write crime fiction. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. I definitely try to.
Can, can you tell us about your crime fiction?
I think I'm probably even more gritty with that and more realistic. And I talk a lot about poverty elements in the crime fiction too. and it's way more violent. That's where I am. Put out all my violent fantasies is with the crime fiction.
And where can we find some of your crime fiction?
Punk Noir magazine, Close to the Bone, um, Synchronized Chaos. Me and you both are in that same issue of Switchblade magazine, which that's my crowning achievement in writing. Like I told you, like that's the biggest thing ever for me was being in that issue of Switchblade.
Is there a venue today that you think um, is a good venue for this kind of fiction that really explores what it's like to be down and out in America?
Um, well, definitely Switchblade before they discontinued making it. I'd say Pulp Modern, what you do, anything you do is going to be, legit. And I mean, there's a lot of places.
So, Robert, what should we look for from you in the near future here?
Well, after Nothing is Sacred, I have another book coming pretty soon after called All Times of the Night. That's my fourth short story collection, and it's going to be published by Alien Buddha Press. It's my first time trying to write a short story collection with that connects together each story to tell an overall story. That was my other three collections were more standalone stories.
Okay. All right. Well, Nothing is Sacred is scheduled to be released on July 23rd, 2024. And if you want to read poetry that is unabashedly honest, I wholeheartedly suggest you read it. Robert, thank you for joining us today.
I appreciate it, Alec, and I appreciate you publishing this book for me and working with me.
Oh, it's no problem. It's, uh, it's an honor. Thank you.
All right, appreciate it, man. Be safe.